The courtroom was unnervingly silent as 5-year-old Emily Carter stepped through the heavy wooden doors, her tiny hand clutching the leash of Rex, a German shepherd with a long, jagged scar running along his side. Every eye in the room followed the small girl as she made her way toward the witness stand, her movements hesitant but determined. Judge Mark Sullivan, a seasoned man with years of legal experience, leaned forward slightly, observing the child with a measured gaze. He knew that the weight of the entire case rested on her fragile shoulders. Emily was the sole witness to an attempted abduction, a case that, if won, could put a dangerous man behind bars for life. But there was one problem. Emily hadn't spoken a single word since the attack. Across the courtroom, Richard Hale sat at the defense table, his expression composed, even smug. A 45-year-old software engineer with an unassuming appearance, Hale had been arrested after an eyewitness placed him at the scene of Emily's attempted abduction. But his defense was solid. No physical evidence, no confession, and a witness who couldn't testify. His lawyer had already crafted a strategy that hinged on discrediting the traumatized child's ability to identify him. But then, something happened. As Emily settled onto the witness chair, her green eyes met Richard Hale's. Her small fingers trembled as they made a subtle movement, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. It was a silent signal, one she had learned over weeks of therapy. Only two beings in the room caught it: Rex and Judge Sullivan. Rex's reaction was immediate. The moment Emily's fingers twitched in that silent plea for help, the dog's body went rigid. His ears pricked forward, his muscles coiling like a loaded spring. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within his chest, a sound of warning, of recognition. His golden brown eyes locked onto Hale, unwavering and piercing. The reaction sent a ripple of unease through the courtroom. A murmur spread through the spectators, whispers of speculation filling the air. Something about the dog's behavior struck a chord. This wasn't just a well-trained support animal reacting to his handler's distress. This was something deeper, something primal. Judge Sullivan's hand came down hard on the gavel, the sharp crack echoing like thunder through the room. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he declared, his voice unusually urgent. The prosecutor, Jenna Collins, shot him a questioning look, but he didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he glanced at Emily, who clung to Rex like a lifeline. Something significant had just happened, and he needed to understand exactly what it was before the trial proceeded any further. As the courtroom emptied, Sullivan remained seated, his mind racing. He had seen many things in his years on the bench, but never had a therapy dog reacted with such undeniable certainty. What had Rex recognized? And more importantly, what did that mean for the case? Outside in the hallway, Emily knelt beside Rex, her tiny hands gripping his fur tightly. Her mother, Sarah Carter, bent down beside her, smoothing back the child's curly hair with trembling fingers. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" she whispered. Emily didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her grip on Rex tightened, her small frame pressing into his side. Jack Monroe, the lead investigator on the case, watched from a few steps away. A grizzled FBI agent with decades of experience, Monroe had a gut instinct that had served him well over the years. And right now, his gut told him that whatever just happened in that courtroom was a game changer. He stepped closer to Judge Sullivan. "Something spooked that dog," he murmured, his voice low. "I'd bet my badge he recognizes Hale from somewhere." Sullivan exhaled slowly, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. "Then, we need to find out where." Meanwhile, inside the defense's private room, Richard Hale sat across from his attorney, Michael Graves. The moment they were alone, the smug confidence on Hale's face twisted into something else. something colder. His fingers drummed against the table as he replayed the moment in his mind. The girl hadn't spoken, but the dog had reacted. "She knows," he muttered under his breath. Graves raised an eyebrow. "What?" Hale forced a small smile. "Nothing," he said, but his mind was already racing. That damned dog. He hadn't considered the animal would be a problem. But now he realized Rex might be the key to unraveling everything. As the 15-minute recess neared its end, Judge Sullivan straightened his robes and took a deep breath. He didn't believe in coincidences, and right now, something told him that Rex had just given them the most important clue of the trial. It was time to dig deeper. And for the first time since the case had started, he felt the tide shifting, before the silence, before the courtroom, before the terror that stole her voice. Emily Carter was a vibrant chatterbox of a child. At 5 years old, she was the kind of girl who filled a room with endless stories, her bright blue eyes gleaming with curiosity and mischief. She loved fairy tales, stuffed animals, and the way her mother read bedtime stories with different voices for each character. She had never known fear until that fateful afternoon. It had been a perfect spring day, the kind where the scent of blooming flowers drifted through the air, and the warm sun painted golden streaks across the backyard. Sarah Carter had been watching her daughter from the kitchen window, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips as Emily twirled in the yard, her pink dress flaring like a dancer's. David Carter was due home in a few hours, and she had been debating whether to start dinner or wait for him. It should have been an ordinary afternoon. It should have been safe. At 3:42 p.m. Sarah's phone rang. It was her sister calling from out of state, and she stepped inside for what she thought would be a quick conversation. 4 minutes. That was all it took. When she returned to the yard, the gate stood ajar. A wave of cold terror shot through her veins. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the space where her daughter had been. Emily was still there, but she wasn't alone. A black van idled near the curb, its side door slightly open. A man knelt beside Emily, his smile unnervingly warm. "I have puppies in my van," he was saying, his voice smooth, practiced. "Special ones. They need a little girl to take care of them. Would you like to see?" Sarah's world seemed to slow, her instincts screaming before her mind could process what was happening. Her voice sliced through the air. "Emily!" The man's head snapped up. His smile vanished, replaced by something sharp and calculating. In an instant, he grabbed Emily's arm. Emily froze. She didn't scream, she didn't fight. She only stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes, as if some deep-rooted fear had locked her in place. Across the street, Martha Jenkins, a retired nurse walking her terrier, saw everything unfold. Her voice, weathered with age but strong with conviction, rang out. "Hey, get away from that child." The man hesitated. His grip loosened for a fraction of a second. That was all it took. Emily yanked her arm free and bolted toward her mother. Sarah scooped her daughter into her arms just as the van's engine roared. The tires screeched against the pavement as the vehicle sped away, leaving black streaks of rubber on the road. Sarah clutched Emily tightly, her heart pounding against her ribs. But Emily didn't cry. She didn't say a word. She only buried her face into her mother's shoulder and trembled. The police arrived within minutes. Detective Jack Monroe, a seasoned investigator from the FBI's Child Abduction Task Force, took immediate control of the scene. His graying hair and sharp brown eyes spoke of years spent chasing shadows, searching for missing children who were often never found. He had seen this pattern before. Too many times. "He fits the profile," Monroe muttered, flipping through a worn notebook. 4 children have disappeared in the last 18 months. All approached near their homes. all lured by promises of puppies. His partner, Agent Lisa Grant, knelt beside Emily, her voice gentle but firm. "Sweetheart, do you remember what the man looked like?" Silence. Sarah brushed Emily's hair back, her hands trembling. "Honey, it's okay, you're safe now. Can you tell the nice officer what he looked like?" Emily's small hands gripped her mother's sweater tightly, but she didn't speak. She didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, shutting her voice off completely. "She hasn't said a word since I picked her up," Sarah whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "She just won't talk." Agent Grant exchanged a look with Monroe. "Selective mutism," she murmured, a trauma response. Monroe sighed, rubbing his temple. "Without a statement, we don't have much. The description is vague. A man, a black van, it could be anyone." Martha Jenkins, who had witnessed the abduction attempt, stepped forward. "I got part of the license plate," she said firmly. "The first 3 letters, YKZ. Monroe's gaze snapped to her. "That's something." Sarah, still clutching Emily, felt a surge of helplessness. Her daughter, once so full of life, had retreated into herself, and in the days that followed, it only got worse. Emily stopped playing, she stopped drawing. She refused to leave the house, flinching at the sight of passing cars. She barely slept, and when she did, her nights were filled with silent nightmares, her small body thrashing against invisible threats. Her screams never came, only gasps of terror that woke her parents in the dead of night. Sarah and David tried everything. Story time, favorite foods, her beloved stuffed bunny. Nothing worked. The child they knew was slipping further and further away. One evening, Sarah sat across from David at the kitchen table, her eyes hollow from exhaustion. "The therapist recommended a support animal," she said quietly. "A therapy dog." David ran a tired hand through his hair. "You really think that'll help?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but I'm willing to try anything." Neither of them could have known how much that decision would change everything. Because while Emily had lost her voice, there was someone who could still hear her. And his name was Rex. The air inside Dr. Laura Bennett's Animal Rehabilitation Center was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the earthy musk of fur. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the occasional scratch of claws against the tiled floor. On a large orthopedic bed near the window, a German shepherd lay still, his deep brown eyes tracking every movement with quiet intensity. His name was Rex. Once, he had been one of the finest canine officers in the city's police force, a dog whose instincts and training had saved lives. But now, he bore the scars of sacrifice, one particularly jagged mark running down his right flank, a permanent reminder of the night that ended his career. 3 years ago, during a raid to rescue a kidnapped child, Rex had lunged at an armed suspect without hesitation. The man had slashed at him with a knife meant for an officer, cutting deep into his flesh. Rex had subdued the suspect even as blood darkened his fur. But in the months that followed, the injury never fully healed. His mobility was affected, and the department, strapped for funds, made the difficult decision to retire him. He had been placed on a euthanasia list, deemed unfit for service. That was before Laura stepped in. Dr. Bennett had been running the therapy animal program for years, specializing in cases where animals could help trauma survivors. When she heard about Rex's case, she fought to adopt him, convinced that his sharp mind and unwavering loyalty still had value. And now, she was about to test that belief. Sarah Carter sat nervously in a chair, her fingers gripping the fabric of her skirt. Emily stood behind her, peeking out from behind her mother's shoulder. The little girl had refused to speak since the incident 2 weeks ago, and though she had attended therapy, nothing had coaxed a word from her. Laura knelt to Emily's level, her voice gentle. "Hi, Emily. My name is Laura. I work with very special dogs that help kids who have been through scary things." Emily said nothing, her green eyes flickering to the large German shepherd a few feet away. Rex sat patiently, his ears perked forward, but he didn't move toward her. He simply watched, his presence steady and unthreatening. "Would you like to meet him?" Laura asked. The little girl didn't answer, but she didn't run either. That was the start. Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair. "He's a very nice dog, sweetheart. He used to be a police dog, just like the ones in your storybooks." Laura gestured to Rex and gave a quiet command. "Stay." The German shepherd didn't so much as twitch. Laura turned back to Emily. "You don't have to come close if you don't want to. Rex will wait right here. But if you feel ready, you can put out your hand and he'll come to you." Emily hesitated. For long moments she remained frozen in place. Then, inch by inch, she stepped out from behind her mother. Her tiny hand lifted, hesitant but deliberate. Rex remained still, waiting for the final cue. When Laura nodded, he slowly lowered his head and took a careful step forward. Then another, and another. The moment his warm breath touched Emily's palm, something shifted. Emily's fingers curled slightly, brushing through the dog's thick fur. The connection was made. Sarah gasped softly, pressing a hand to her mouth. It was the first time Emily had reached out to anything, or anyone, since the attack. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Oh, baby." Emily's small fingers burrowed deeper into Rex's fur, gripping him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had turned terrifyingly uncertain. Laura smiled. "That's a good girl, Emily. Rex likes you." The child said nothing, but she didn't let go. Over the next few weeks, Rex and Emily became inseparable. At home, she would sit beside him for hours, her tiny hands tracing the scar along his side. When nightmares woke her in the middle of the night, it was Rex's steady heartbeat that calmed her. Though she still refused to speak, she began drawing again. Simple crayon pictures of a girl and a dog standing together against shadowy figures. One afternoon, while sitting on the floor of Laura's office, Emily was watching Rex perform a simple trick when something remarkable happened. "Good boy," she whispered. The words were so soft that for a moment, Sarah thought she had imagined them. But when she turned, she saw Emily staring at Rex, her lips slightly parted in wonder, as if she too had surprised herself. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Laura placed a gentle hand on Sarah's arm. "She trusts him," she murmured. "Sometimes trust is the first step toward finding your voice again." Sarah squeezed her hand. "Then, we'll follow wherever that trust leads." And it would lead them somewhere they never expected. To a courtroom where a monster would finally be unmasked. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. The seats in the gallery were filled with journalists, families, and legal observers, all watching with anticipation as one of the most high-profile trials in recent memory was about to begin. In the center of the room, the defendant, Richard Hale, sat beside his attorney, his expression unreadable. Despite the weight of the charges against him, he appeared disturbingly calm, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished wood of the defense table. Seated beside her mother, Emily Carter clutched the leash of Rex tightly, her small fingers wrapped around the thick fabric as if it were a lifeline. The German shepherd sat alert beside her, his ears pricked forward, his deep brown eyes locked onto Hale. Every so often, his nose would twitch, as if he were scenting something familiar in the air. All rise." The bailiff's voice rang through the chamber as Judge Mark Sullivan entered, his robe flowing behind him. He took his seat at the elevated bench, his sharp eyes scanning the room before settling briefly on Emily and Rex. He had already made a ruling allowing the therapy dog to be present, but he knew that decision was far from universally accepted. "Before we proceed with opening statements," Sullivan said, his deep voice measured and controlled, "the court will hear arguments regarding the presence of the support animal in these proceedings." Michael Graves, the defense attorney, rose smoothly from his seat and adjusted his tie. "Your Honor," he began, his tone polite but firm, "while we understand the prosecution's argument for emotional support, the presence of this animal is highly prejudicial. A large German Shepherd in the courtroom may evoke an emotional response from the jury that could unfairly bias them against my client. We request that the dog be removed during testimony." Jenna Collins, the lead prosecutor, stood immediately in response. "Your Honor, Emily Carter is 5 years old and a trauma survivor. She has been diagnosed with selective mutism as a result of her experience. Rex is not here as a spectacle. He is here as a medically necessary support animal. His presence allows Emily to participate in these proceedings without undue distress." Judge Sullivan sat back, his expression unreadable. "I have already reviewed the documentation submitted by the child psychologist and the animal behaviorist. The dog remains." A murmur spread through the courtroom, some in agreement, others grumbling under their breath. Graves pressed his lips together, displeased but unwilling to argue further. He returned to his seat, shooting a quick glance at Hale, who remained eerily expressionless. The trial began in earnest. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of Hale's actions, a pattern of manipulation, deception, and predatory behavior spanning years. Witnesses were called, including the elderly neighbor Martha Jenkins, who recounted the terrifying moment she saw Hale trying to lure Emily into his van. Her voice trembled as she described the way he had grabbed the child's arm before fleeing when confronted. Emily sat silently through it all, her small frame dwarfed by the large wooden chair. Her fingers occasionally flexed around the leash, but she never let go. Whenever the tension became too much, she would look down at Rex, who remained perfectly still, his quiet presence grounding her. Then, it was time for her testimony. A hush fell over the courtroom as Emily was gently led to the witness stand. Sarah Carter walked with her, her protective gaze never leaving her daughter. She helped Emily into the seat before stepping away, though her every muscle was taut with the desire to scoop her daughter into her arms and take her far from this place. Jenna Collins approached carefully, her demeanor soft and warm. "Hi, Emily," she said with a gentle smile. "I know this is a little scary, but remember, you don't have to say anything you don't want to. You can just nod or shake your head if you feel more comfortable. And if you ever need a break, you can let us know." Emily didn't look at her. Her gaze was fixed on the table, her breathing shallow. But then, as if sensing her unease, Rex pressed his body lightly against her leg. She reached down and gripped a handful of his fur. Slowly, she nodded. "Good," Jenna said, keeping her voice light. "Emily, can you tell us who was with you in your yard that day?" Emily hesitated. She didn't lift her head, but after a long moment she slowly raised her arm and pointed directly at Richard Hale. The defendant's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a brief, involuntary tightening of his jaw. Graves immediately stood. "Objection. The child has been repeatedly shown images of my client prior to trial. This identification is unreliable." Judge Sullivan held up a hand. "Overruled. The jury will determine the credibility of the witness." Jenna continued. "Emily, Did this man say anything to you that day?" The child didn't speak. Instead, she made a small movement with her hand. A subtle sign. It was the same signal she had given before. The one that Rex understood. The German Shepherd responded instantly. His ears snapped forward, his muscles tensed, and a deep, guttural growl rumbled from his chest. It wasn't aggressive, it was a warning. The reaction sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Even Judge Sullivan sat forward, his brow furrowed. Graves stood again, this time more urgently. "Your Honor, I object. This is theatrics." But Sullivan wasn't listening. He was watching Rex. The dog had gone utterly still, his entire focus locked onto Hale, as if recognizing a scent only he could perceive. It was the same reaction he had when Emily first saw Hale. The same instant, instinctual response. A thought struck Sullivan then. He turned to Jenna. "Miss Collins," he said, his voice carefully measured, "has this animal had any prior interaction with the defendant?" Jenna hesitated. "Not to my knowledge, Your Honor." Sullivan turned to the defense table. "Mr. Hale, have you encountered this dog before?" For the first time, Hale showed real emotion. His fingers, which had been tapping so calmly earlier, now clenched into a fist. He remained silent. Then Jenna's eyes widened as a sudden realization hit her. She turned to her co-counsel and whispered something quickly. A second later, a member of the prosecution team rushed out of the courtroom. "What is going on?" Graves demanded, his patience thinning. Jenna straightened, her expression unreadable. "Your Honor, I request a short recess. There may be new evidence relevant to this case." Judge Sullivan studied her for a long moment before nodding. 15-minute recess. As the courtroom emptied, whispers filled the air. Speculation spread like wildfire. Had Rex just recognized Richard Hale? And if so, from where? Something told Judge Sullivan that the answer to that question would change everything. The weight of the case bore down on the prosecution team as new developments surfaced. Richard Hale had been officially linked to multiple disappearances, yet, without Emily's full testimony, the trial teetered on the edge of uncertainty. What no one expected, however, was that the key to unraveling the case would not come from the child, but from the German Shepherd who never left her side. The morning was crisp as the prosecution team, led by Jenna Collins, presented their next motion to introduce new forensic evidence. The soil samples found in Richard Hale's van had been analyzed, and the results pointed to a very specific location: a remote, unoccupied cabin in the northern woods. Detective Jack Monroe, having worked on similar cases for decades, knew what this could mean. "Your Honor," Collins addressed Judge Sullivan, "we request a 24-hour recess to follow up on a crucial lead. We believe this evidence may provide the final piece needed to close this case." Michael Graves, Hale's defense attorney, immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a delay tactic. My client has already been through extensive questioning, and there is no solid evidence tying him to this so-called cabin. Soil samples are circumstantial at best." Judge Sullivan's stern gaze silenced Graves. "Motion granted," he ruled. "The prosecution has 24 hours. Court adjourned." As soon as the judge's gavel struck, Monroe and his team mobilized. Rex, Emily's ever-watchful protector, was brought along for the operation. His reaction to Hale had been unmistakable. Perhaps he could sense something that human eyes had missed. The search team arrived at the desolate cabin by early afternoon. The place was eerily silent, the surrounding trees whispering with the wind. A thick layer of dust covered the porch, yet faint footprints leading toward the back door suggested recent activity. Rex was the first to react. As soon as they approached the cabin, the dog's ears perked, his nose twitching with keen intensity. His body stiffened, tail erect, muscles poised like a coiled spring. He let out a low growl, pacing anxiously at the threshold. "This place is wrong," Monroe murmured. "Rex knows something's here." The team proceeded cautiously, weapons drawn. Inside, the cabin was sparse. A table, a cot, empty food cans stacked in a corner. But then, Monroe noticed something peculiar. The wooden floor near the back wall had an unnatural seam, a faint indentation that seemed out of place. He knocked on it, hollow. "There's something under here," he said. With swift precision, the officers pried the boards loose. What lay beneath sent a shiver down their spines. A narrow staircase spiraled down into a hidden basement. The air grew cold and damp as they descended, the dim light revealing a horrific sight. Children's belongings, old toys, small shoes, a faded pink backpack. And in the farthest corner, chained but still alive, was a girl, Emma Sullivan. The 8-year-old had been missing for 6 months. Her face was pale, her clothes ragged, but the moment she saw the officers, her eyes filled with tears of recognition and relief. "Help," she whispered, voice hoarse from disuse. Rex reacted immediately, straining against his leash, whining as if sensing the suffering this child had endured. Monroe rushed forward, unlocking the chains, scooping Emma into his arms. "You're safe now," he assured her. "We've got you." Emma clung to him, her frail body trembling. The search had finally come to an end, but the nightmare wasn't over yet. Back at the courthouse, the news of Emma's rescue spread like wildfire. The gallery was packed as Collins prepared for the final strike against Hale. The judge allowed Emma's discovery to be introduced as evidence, along with the soil sample linking the cabin to his vehicle. "Mr. Hale," Collins addressed the defendant, her voice sharp as steel. "How do you explain the presence of an abducted child locked in a basement on a property tied directly to you?" For the first time, Richard Hale looked shaken. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. Jenna Collins pressed forward, her tone unwavering. "Your DNA was found on the chains. Your vehicle's tires match the tracks outside the cabin. And more importantly, Emma Sullivan is alive, meaning she can testify against you." The weight of those words settled over the courtroom. A single survivor meant a witness who could single-handedly dismantle his defense. Hale's carefully constructed composure began to crumble. His lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but it was clear he was cornered. And then, it happened again. Rex, lying at Emily's feet, suddenly lifted his head, his eyes narrowing at Hale. His hackles rose, a deep growl vibrating through his chest. The room went silent as the German shepherd took slow, deliberate steps forward, his gaze locked onto the defendant. It was a look of recognition. Hale flinched. Everyone saw it. The man who had maintained his arrogance throughout the trial was now visibly sweating, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He turned to his attorney, muttering something frantically. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I want to change my plea." Gasps erupted across the room. Judge Sullivan's gaze darkened. "Mr. Hale, are you stating that you wish to plead guilty?" The room held its collective breath. Hale exhaled shakily. "Yes." The trial's abrupt end sent shockwaves through the nation. Richard Hale was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his conviction sealing the fate of a man who had terrorized families for years. But the true heroes of the case weren't just the lawyers or the detectives. It was a 5-year-old girl who had found her courage, and a dog who had never given up on her. In the days following the sentencing, Emily spoke her first words in weeks. Holding Rex's face in her small hands, she whispered, "Thank you." Her parents wept, knowing that their daughter was finally finding her way back to them. And as Rex wagged his tail, nuzzling her gently, it was clear. Some bonds were unbreakable. No matter how dark the world became, there would always be those willing to stand against the darkness, even if they walked on 4 legs.